Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what you think would be the most dangerous part of traveling in the year 1402. Now let us step onto a medieval road where survival depended on preparation, instinct, and a measure of luck. In 1402, distance was not measured in kilometers but in risk. A journey of 50 miles could take more than a week, depending on terrain and weather. There were no paved highways, no marked lanes, and no streetlights. What people called a road was often a simple track carved by repeated footsteps, wagon wheels, and animal hooves. Rain transformed these paths into thick mud. Summer heat hardened them into uneven stone and dust. Each season reshaped the route. Travelers moved slowly because the land itself dictated speed. A loaded wagon averaged 3 to 4 miles per hour on favorable ground. Horses required rest, water, and forage. When terrain shifted to hills or rocky stretches, progress slowed dramatically. A broken axle or injured animal could end a journey entirely. There were no repair stations waiting ahead, only the hope of reaching the next village before nightfall. Forests were among the most feared segments of any route. Dense tree cover reduced visibility and muffled sound. Bandits understood these advantages. Ambushes often occurred in narrow passages where wagons had to slow down. Local authorities rarely patrolled distant woodland paths. Law existed in theory, but enforcement faded with distance from major towns. River crossings introduced another layer of uncertainty. Bridges were rare and often poorly maintained. Wooden planks weakened by rot could collapse under heavy wagons. Ferries operated by local boatmen charged fees that varied according to demand. Sudden storms or upstream rain could swell rivers overnight, making a safe crossing impossible by morning. A traveler who misjudged water depth risked losing cargo, animals, or life. Inns provided shelter, yet they were not sanctuaries. Shared sleeping quarters meant strangers rested side by side. Theft was common. News traveled by word of mouth, so rumors of unrest or disease spread quickly but not always accurately. Choosing where to sleep required reading the mood of a town as carefully as reading the road. Merchants rarely traveled alone. Caravans formed for protection, combining goods and manpower. A group of 10 armed traders discouraged opportunistic bandits. Still, alliances were built on fragile trust. Every traveler carried valuables. Suspicion accompanied cooperation. Navigation depended on memory and landmarks. Church towers, rivers, distinctive hills, and roadside shrines guided direction. Maps existed but were rare and often imprecise. A wrong turn could add days to a journey or lead directly into hostile territory. Night travel was avoided whenever possible. Darkness erased paths completely. Without artificial lighting, even a familiar road became disorienting. In 1402, travel was not simply movement from one place to another. It was an ongoing negotiation with terrain, weather, strangers, and uncertainty. And this was only the beginning of the risks waiting further along the road. Political boundaries added invisible danger to every visible mile. Europe in 1402 was divided into overlapping territories controlled by kings, dukes, bishops, and city councils. A traveler could cross 3 jurisdictions in a single day. Each border often required payment. Toll collectors guarded bridges and mountain passes, demanding coins or goods in exchange for passage. Refusal could result in confiscation or arrest. Even when payment was made, there was no guarantee of protection beyond that point. The true reversal came when heavily traveled routes proved just as dangerous as isolated paths. Major trade roads attracted merchants, but they also attracted organized criminal groups. Some bandits operated with quiet support from local officials who benefited from shared profit. A road marked as safe in one season could become hostile after a political dispute or a failed harvest. Loyalty shifted quickly in regions affected by conflict. Military campaigns intensified instability. When armies marched, they consumed resources along their path. Villages were stripped of food, animals, and tools. Roads were churned into deep ruts by armored horses and supply wagons. Bridges collapsed under excessive weight. Civilians traveling shortly after a military column often found destroyed infrastructure and frightened communities unwilling to offer assistance. Season determined strategy. Spring brought swollen rivers and deep mud. Summer allowed faster movement but increased the risk of dehydration for both animals and humans. Autumn created urgency as daylight shortened and harvest labor reduced available lodging. Winter was the most dangerous period. Snow concealed road edges. Ice made slopes treacherous. A single misstep could overturn a wagon or break a horse's leg. Communication moved at the speed of hooves. A rider on a fresh horse could cover 30 to 40 miles in a day under ideal conditions. However, travelers often entered regions unaware of recent uprisings, outbreaks of disease, or newly imposed tolls. Information delay meant preparation was based on outdated knowledge. This uncertainty magnified risk. Religious pilgrims accepted hardship as part of spiritual devotion. Routes to sacred destinations were known but not maintained uniformly. Pilgrims walked for weeks, relying on charity and monastery hospitality. Their vulnerability was high, yet shared identity sometimes granted limited protection from fellow believers. Wealth changed the experience but did not eliminate danger. Affluent travelers could hire armed escorts or ride stronger horses. They carried letters of passage sealed by influential authorities. Even so, escorts could be outnumbered, and forged documents were common. Money made someone a more attractive target. Accidents rivaled human threats. Wagon wheels fractured on uneven stone. Leather harnesses snapped without warning. Storms emerged quickly, drenching supplies and weakening morale. Exposure to cold or heat could kill as surely as a blade. Travel in 1402 demanded constant assessment of risk. Every choice of route, companion, and timing shaped the outcome. Yet even the most cautious traveler could not control the larger forces shaping the land. In the final stretch of our journey, we will see how rulers began to recognize the economic value of safer roads and how fragile reforms slowly altered the medieval travel experience. As trade expanded across regions, rulers began to understand a simple reality. Safer roads meant greater wealth. Merchants who survived their journeys returned with goods, taxes, and influence. Those who vanished into forests or drowned at unstable crossings represented lost revenue. Gradually, some authorities experimented with more structured oversight. Bridge maintenance became a priority in prosperous territories. Stone replaced aging wood in key crossings where commerce was heavy. Tolls were standardized in certain regions to reduce arbitrary fees that discouraged movement. Patrols were occasionally assigned to stretches of road known for repeated attacks. These efforts were inconsistent and limited by resources, but they signaled a shift in thinking. Travel was no longer viewed only as a private risk. It was an economic artery. Market towns positioned along major routes developed reputations for reliability. Regular fares created predictable gathering points. When travelers knew that protection was stronger near these centers, they adjusted routes accordingly. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain corridors became relatively safer because traffic volume itself discouraged isolated attacks. A lone wagon was vulnerable. A steady flow of movement created informal security. Still, improvement was fragile. A failed harvest, a succession dispute, or a regional war could undo years of stability. Roads were not permanent structures in the modern sense. They were living pathways shaped by climate, politics, and population. Without continuous maintenance, ruts deepened and drainage failed. Without stable governance, patrols disappeared. Survival in 1402 ultimately depended on preparation more than infrastructure. Experienced travelers planned departure around weather cycles. They carried spare parts for wagons and extra horseshoes. They joined caravans whenever possible and avoided forest stretches at dusk. They studied landmarks carefully and confirmed directions with multiple sources before committing to a route. The absence of streetlights meant that night was absolute. Darkness erased the world beyond a few steps. Fires were dangerous to carry while moving and revealed position to potential attackers. Camps were chosen with defensive awareness, often near natural barriers such as hills or rivers that limited approach angles. Watches were assigned in rotating shifts when groups were large enough to manage it. Travel in 1402 was a test of endurance, judgment, and adaptability. There were no illuminated highways guiding movement, no centralized police guaranteeing safety. Roads were uncertain lines drawn across a restless landscape. Yet despite the danger, people continued to move. Trade expanded. Pilgrims walked. Messengers rode. The medieval world remained connected not by safety, but by necessity and courage. In the end, the measure of a successful journey was simple. Arrival meant survival. And in an age without safe roads or streetlights, that outcome could never be taken for granted. Over time, the repeated experience of danger forced a quiet transformation in how societies viewed mobility. Travel in 1402 was never comfortable, but it was essential. Kingdoms relied on messengers to carry orders. Merchants sustained urban economies. Pilgrims reinforced cultural and religious networks. The constant movement of people kept regions connected despite the hazards between them. Local rulers who invested in even modest improvements often saw measurable results. A repaired bridge reduced detours that previously added days to a journey. Clearing fallen trees from forest roads widened visibility and reduced ambush points. Establishing predictable toll stations discouraged rogue collectors who had once operated unofficial checkpoints. These were not sweeping reforms, but incremental adjustments that stabilized key corridors. Some territories experimented with official escorts along particularly dangerous stretches. While limited in scope, these patrols signaled authority. Bandit groups thrived in power vacuums. When enforcement became visible, even sporadically, opportunistic crime decreased. However, maintaining patrols required funding, and funding depended on successful trade. Stability fed itself, but instability spread just as quickly. Technological limitations remained a constant constraint. Without advanced engineering tools, most roads continued to follow natural contours. Drainage relied on shallow ditches that clogged easily. Heavy rain erased months of improvement in a single storm. In mountainous regions, narrow passes remained vulnerable to rockslides and snow accumulation. Travelers adjusted expectations accordingly, knowing that delay was part of the process. Preparation evolved into an informal science. Experienced merchants kept written notes describing routes, distances between inns, quality of wells, and reliability of ferrymen. Knowledge became a valuable asset, shared within trusted circles. A well-chosen departure date could mean the difference between smooth passage and catastrophic delay. Timing markets and seasonal fairs required understanding not just geography, but rhythm. Despite all reforms and precautions, unpredictability never vanished. Political alliances shifted without warning. A lord who guaranteed safe passage one year might be replaced by a rival the next. A region peaceful in spring could descend into conflict by autumn. Travelers learned to read subtle signs such as abandoned farms, reduced market activity, or armed patrols moving in unusual numbers. By the early decades that followed, gradual improvements in administration, record-keeping, and infrastructure laid foundations for safer corridors in certain parts of Europe. Yet the memory of earlier vulnerability remained embedded in travel culture. Journeys were planned with humility. Risk was assumed, not dismissed. Travel in 1402 functioned without illuminated streets, standardized highways, or centralized security. It relied on endurance, cooperation, and constant awareness. Movement was never passive. Every mile required decision and adaptation. Survival was the true destination, and arrival was proof of skill as much as luck.